Okay. You can hear me?
Yes.
Okay. Hi, everybody. I'm so happy to see you all here tonight. It's so fun to watch everybody come into the little boxes. I am Kristen Miller, Executive Director of Alaska Wilderness League. I am calling in from Washington, D.C., the traditional homelands of the Anacostia and Piscataway peoples. And I'm really excited to be able to introduce tonight's incredible Geography of Hope episode and to introduce Bjorn. You guys are all, I think I'm looking at everybody's names. I know a lot of you folks are longtime members and supporters of Alaska Wilderness League, so thank you for joining us. I think most of you probably know that in 2022, we founded the Adam Kolton Alaska Storytelling Grant Award. So if you were with us last month for our Geography of Hope, you had the opportunity to hear from our inaugural award winner of that Storytelling Grant Award, Polly Anderson, who talked about her work teaching storytelling to Indigenous communities across Alaska. And tonight you have the awesome opportunity to hear from Bjørn Olson, who is our second Storytelling Grant Award winner, who is going to talk about the documentary that he's working on about how climate change is dramatically impacting a rural Indigenous community in Alaska. We've been able to give these grant awards thanks to generous donations that we've received to the Adam Kolton Memorial Fund. Adam Kolton was our executive director, and he loved a good story. And he also loved the idea of connecting storytelling with the work that we do at Alaska Wilderness League to protect lands and waters. This Storytelling Grant Award was the first one that I was on the selection committee. And so it was really cool. I was really excited. It was so awesome to see the diversity of storytellers that exist across Alaska and across the United States, telling the stories about Alaska's public lands and waters, and the diversity of art and the diversity of ways that people are telling stories. It's just really cool. And it was really hard to choose a winner. But Bjørn Olson really stood out. We were really impressed first with his commitment to telling the story of Little Diomede that he's going to talk about tonight, and just with the quality of work that he does. I think you guys are really going to enjoy hearing from him. And Bjørn, thank you for being with us. We really, really appreciate you joining us. I think you guys are going to be very inspired. And I ask that as you listen to the story, you consider donating to the Adam Kolton Memorial Fund. This is what is going to enable us to support future storytellers and to keep this program going long into the future. So we will give you all the information you need. There will be something in the chat to tell you how to donate. But I appreciate you considering that. And mostly I'm just thankful to see so many people in the little boxes on the screen, so many people here with us tonight. And I'm thankful to Bjørn for being with us and for sharing. So with that, Bjørn, I'll turn it over to you to talk about your work.
Thank you so much, Kristen. I'm going to share my screen here. So I have to preface that this is such an involved story, and there's no way that I will be able to get to everything. And so I'm hoping that I can leave some time at the end if there is time for questions, because I would assume that there's just no, like I say, there's just no way to cover it all in an hour talk. But so briefly tonight, I'm going to be talking about my work with the Native Tribe of Diomede, going back to 2019. I was reached out to by their environmental coordinator, who is a lifelong Diomede resident, which is to say an Inupiat woman that, her lineage goes back for, thousands of years there. And she became aware of my work as a filmmaker and a climate change activist in Alaska, and was able to receive funding from her General Assistance Program grant, which is what all of the tribes receive to typically do more like boots on the ground environmental work in each of their, the tribal communities. But she got some funding secured for me to be able to make a film about how rapidly climate change is impacting and affecting the cultural and traditional ecological ways of life that this, tribe has had, since time immemorial. And so that's kind of the background of what got this going. We got the project going. Once the pandemic happened, there were all these hassles, like it just blow past, like the challenges of making a film in Diomede. But after 2.5 years, we needed to have something submitted to fulfill that grant. And so I did. I've made a draft of the film that satisfied that grant, but I was unsatisfied with the outcome because I knew that there was a more in-depth story that needed to be told. And so I received permission from the tribe to seek further funding. And so that was last summer that I received that approval from the tribe. And then this Adam Kolton storyteller grant kind of came upon my lap. I was going to look to the Alaska Humanities Forum or the Rasmussen Foundation, but this I had no idea what the competition was like, and I'm incredibly grateful to the Alaska Wilderness League and the Adam Kolton storyteller grant, because it is no small endeavor to make a film in this very remote place. So just real briefly, a little bit about who I am. Born and raised in Alaska. I grew up in the interior of Alaska in a subsistence household. Hunting and fishing and gardening and foraging are integral components of my life growing up, and they still are now. In my teenage years, I became fascinated with wilderness adventure, and I've explored Alaska almost exclusively. I've not really, visited many other places in the world. And as I became more and more immersed in wilderness travel in Alaska, that started to really inform my environmental activism and my climate change activism. And eventually that turned into needing to be able to have an outlet. So first it was writing and photography, but then that really turned into filmmaking. And so the breadth of work, I've now produced over 100, short and a few feature-length films, but they're really Alaska-centric, generally for Alaskan audiences. And so it was in this kind of, this circle of things that led to the Native Tribe of Diomede reaching out to me. But this is one of the few films that I've ever worked on where I really feel like it's important that people outside, I feel like it's important for people within Alaska, because even within Alaska, people I feel like don't understand the peculiarities and the interesting and special things about Diomede. But I think certainly most people outside of Alaska have no concept. And so to center us here, I should have included, I made this map for an Alaskan audience. So Anchorage, for reference, you can see my cursor is down here, and I live down here in Homer. And so Nome is the central hub community for what's called the Bering Straits region. And the Bering Straits is made up of St. Lawrence Island, Little Diomede, and the Seward Peninsula, by and large. That's the Bering Strait region of Alaska. And so Little Diomede is one of two islands that are in the middle of the Bering Strait, where mainland Alaska and Siberia nearly touch. A mere 3 miles to the west of Little Diomede is Big Diomede. The international date line runs between those two islands. So you're looking into tomorrow, and you're also looking at an island that's owned by Russia, where you cannot legally pass. And so that, just to kind of orient us in the world, that's where I'm talking about. And the number one thing, there are so many things to talk about in this, conversation of, what is happening in this part of the world environmentally. And, of course, you can just use, the term climate change, but what does that actually mean? And what kind of impacts is that having? And so sea ice for this community, and for, I would say, the Arctic in general, is, an enormous thing that everybody that has lived there for, their lifetime and the thousands of years before, there's cultural ecological knowledge that talks about how you plan for your year, how you plan for knowing when is the right time to do things, when is it safe, when is it not safe, and all of that has been disrupted in a very short period of time. And I'm going to get to some of the the particulars of that, but this is an idea of what, the broken sea ice, it looks like often now at a time of year when it otherwise would be almost entirely sea ice. So this affects polar bears, this affects travel, this affects walrus, this affects so many things. This is Faraway Rock, which is one small rock, just outside of Diomede, that like I say, in the not too distant past, talking 15 years ago, it would be all sea ice around here. And so on this slope, at the base of that slope, that's where the tribe of Diomede is situated. And as far as I can tell, the archaeological evidence that supports with certainty goes back 3,000 years. But with sea level rise, we know that underneath the water there was more village site before, and so it's hard to say with certainty. But the people there say 10,000 years is how long people have been inhabiting this island. But like I say, at least it's many thousands no matter what. And one of the things that is happening here that has happened in a very short period of time is that beginning in the 1940s, air travel started becoming a very, very common thing in Alaska as a means to, supply mail, flying in and out of rural communities. And so there's nowhere flat on Diomede. It's a very steep, island, very steep, rocky granite island. But beginning at about mid-November, there would be enough sea ice to land an airplane on. And so what that required is 4 feet of ice, 4 feet deep, thick ice. And so from, the 50s all the way through till 2013, there had always been enough sea ice to plow a runway. So the Native Tribe of Diomede actually owned road graders and heavy equipment to be able to plow that runway. And so for, half the year, during the, quote unquote winter months, there was, regular airplane travel. And the airplanes are, a lot more capable of flying in inclement weather than helicopters. But 2013 was the last year that they reliably had thick enough sea ice to land the airplane. And so what that has then, the change has been to then rely on helicopters. And these again are flying from Nome, the hub community of Nome, which is a couple hundred miles to the east. And so at the beginning, it kind of seemed like this may, it's obviously more expensive, it's more fuel intensive, they're a little trickier to fly in inclement weather. But at first it kind of didn't seem like that big of a deal. Everything was kind of rolling fine. But then since 2015, there's so much more open water, or areas of open water in the middle of the winter, that even now the helicopter barely is able to make it out there. Because what happens is if you have below freezing air temperatures, but open water, that creates ice fogging condition, and that ice fog can build up on the rotors in the helicopter and sink it. So just for personal reference, this is a very shallow point of view, but from my own personal point of view, I've now spent 2 weeks at 2 different periods of time, both in a winter context and in a summer context on the island, that equate to a little bit over 2 weeks. But I've spent more than 3 weeks in Nome, stranded, trying to get out to Diomede because of this exact condition that we're talking about. So for Diomeders, this is very challenging. If somebody needs medical emergency, or if their storage shelves are completely bare. So this is this unfurling of the impacts of climate is felt pretty regularly. And this just to give you kind of like, again, some bearings. So across, the water there, across the sea ice that you see, that's Big Diomede, Russia, tomorrow, international date line running between the two. And when I was there in this kind of wintry month, all of this was stable enough sea ice that we could go out. We went, ice crabbing, hand lining for crab. And the woman who invited me, who's the environmental coordinator, was taking water quality samples. So there was still, some degree of, this access to the greater world via the sea ice. But historically, and when I say historically, I mean, up to 20 years ago, like not ancient history, but recent history, this sea ice platform was part of what made Diomede such a desirable place to inhabit, because having that stable sea ice platform for the many months of the winter allows you to go hand lining in a variety of different places, to go marine mammal hunting in a variety of different places, and just other, there's other like hunting and gathering techniques that people have depended on because of this stable shelf of sea ice that forms every year. And now that's really kind of being undermined and eroded away from them. And really quickly, I just wanted to give a little shout out to this woman here in the red. This is Opaka Kinga. She's the environmental coordinator, and her sister are kind of the backbone that hold this community together. She's the environmental coordinator, and her sister is the tribal administrator, and they really keep this place functioning and humming, I would say, despite all of these external factors and this kind of like rapidly unfurling external factors that keep being confronted with. And this, I don't know, if people have spent time around sea ice or even lake ice or whatever, this kind of a scene might be familiar. But there are so many wonderful stories from my times spending there with Diomeders about really having this sense of place-based knowledge of knowing when it's safe to go out, when when it's the right time for the certain things that you're harvesting. But all these things are being thrown out of whack, and so the amount of apprehension that people have about doing the things that they were raised knowing how to do is just ever increasing. And so there was no risk in this moment of this ice shelf that this person is standing on there of dislodging, but those are happening more frequently. The ice breaking free while people are out subsistence harvesting. And so this is something that I talk about in a couple different ways in the current draft of the film that I have now, but something I want to embellish further to kind of like really help solidify this point, as that the knowledge that people have been raised with is now becoming much less reliable. And so one of the other kind of big changes that this this tribe, but also many other villages in Alaska, coastal villages in Alaska, is experiencing, is that winter brings the most severe weather, and that's always been the case, right? But in historic times, and again, when I say historic, I mean 15, 20 years ago, the sea ice would have always locked up the shore, entirely in front of the village. So in those winter storms that come with 50, 60, 70, 80 mile an hour winds and waves, there is no waves because the sea ice prevents, there's no water. In 2018 was the first February ever in known history where a storm came in from the south and it blew the fragile sea ice completely away. And then the village was exposed to the onslaught of this intense storm, which ended up flooding their water treatment plant and nearly causing damage to their power plant. And that was immediately followed up again the next 2019 February. It did the exact same thing. So this picture here, this is not an abnormal, event. These waves are just run of the mill everyday waves, but you can see how, close, the buildings are to see, the shoreline. And so it doesn't take much, to like have it be a pretty dramatic storm that causes everyone to, move out of their lower communities and move in with relatives and hope for the best for their infrastructure. That's, a lot of it is really down low. And another, big kind of aspect, this again is just kind of another picture, actually, let me I'll talk about something that doesn't happen anymore at all. But again, in, very recent living memory, part of the annual cycle of sea ice is that in May or June, the ice would break up and it drifts towards the pole in the summer. And a lot of that ice wouldn't entirely melt. And then as autumn comes, that sea ice then starts to drift back south. And because big that second year ice would get jammed between the two islands, and that would create a nucleating, it would allow the nucleation to occur for the new sea ice to form from that old 2-year ice. And so that helped, make the sea ice occur faster, the new winter ice. And so that phenomenon is entirely gone. But so it makes it, there's this challenge that it's just that much more difficult for new ice to freeze up. And I now, that I've been so, involved with this community over the last several years, I stay very connected with these people over social media. And I'm always really curious, watching as, October turns to November, November turns to December into January this year, there still was open water between the two islands. And then finally in late January and early February, it did finally freeze up. This is all, very new stuff for that place. But another one of the things that people really lament about that not having that 2-year ice is that after sea ice has been frozen for 2 years, it has desalinated. And so there used to be these big blue icebergs, everybody calls it blue ice, the 2-year ice, that was locked in between the two islands. And in the middle of the winter, people would go out and chip it to use for drinking water. And it was a real treat, because the water that they have on the island is groundwater. And that groundwater used to be fine, they filter it. But now that the permafrost of the island has melted, it's mineralized, it's picking up minerals, and it's picking up bacterial or biological agents, I should say. And there's a strong flavor to it. And these two things kind of, occurred simultaneously. So they lost their one, source of sweet water, and then their other source of sweet water kind of, concurrently. So now everybody is using distilling, things in their home for their drinking water. And this is, again, another new change, very recent occurrence. So if you ask anybody in Alaska where the walrus capital is, everyone just, intuitively knows that it's Diomede. The native tribe of Diomede has lived, like I say, in this area for thousands of years. And it has been facilitated by and large by their reliance on and dependence upon one marine mammal in particular, and that's the walrus. The walrus is not only their primary staple, subsistence food resource, it's also their materials. They historically used the hides along with stone and sod for their homes. But more importantly, they used the skin for their skin boats. And, all coastal Alaskan indigenous cultures had some form of skin boat. Mostly they had kayaks and what, people call umiaks, which are the open boats. But Diomede really depended almost exclusively on those open skin boats. They don't use the word umiak there. They just call them skin boats. And theirs were big. They had 50 to 60 footer boats, and they were made out of a driftwood frame. And then they were very selective and picky about which walrus hides they would use. For the walrus hide is the skin of the boat, which is an incredibly tough material. I've come across some historic archival footage that I'm able to pull into the film project. And these video footage from our moving image footage from the 60s is, a crew of men coming in from hunting in a 50-foot umiak in enormous seas, probably 5-6 foot seas. And they just drive the boat right onto the beach, crash land onto these massive boulders. And when I ask people out there, is that really how resilient, how tough walrus is? I always, people's eyes light up whenever you talk about, the strength of walrus and their skin boats. They're so very proud of their skin boats. And so the native, and one more thing that I'll add about the walrus is that, and one more thing I'll add about the Native Tribe of Diomede is that in general, they've escaped as intense acculturation as the rest of Alaskan Native cultures have, by my estimation. Because they're so remote, getting goods and services there has been challenging enough that Diomede has maintained their traditional cultural and subsistence practices by and large uninterrupted. And part of that subsistence economy, even before colonization, was their manufacture of really incredible goods. So historically and currently, they would work with their materials through the winter and then load up the entire village into a variety of skin boats and then go trading up into Kotzebue, to Nome, and pre-Soviet era onto the Russian side. And they had, villages on the Russian side that were the same language group, the Inyaluk people. And ivory carving is a big part of that economy. But then so are there other, handy goods. So, sealskin parkas and, just a variety of beautiful handicrafts. And so traditionally, Diomeders would harvest between 400 and 500 walrus a year. And this was enough to keep them in food for the community to get through the winter, building materials, skin boat material, and then the ivory needed to have their own subsistence economy, that they would then use to trade out summer. And so this is just, one of a few examples of these skin boats. And this autonomy and this self-reliance had existed all up and through, the Paleolithic up until 2015. And that was the last year that they were able to harvest enough walrus to be able to selectively choose the best walrus hides to be able to make the skin boats. So they've gone from being able to get 400 or 500 walrus a year down to like maybe 5 or 6. And, the skin is actually a delicacy. And so what I keep hearing over and over again is, if the choice is materials versus food, we're going to choose food. And so now there are these two concurrent things happening where now that there's less sea ice, that means that there's a greater chance for big waves to occur even after the sea ice is broken up. Say in May or June, there would still be a lot of pans of ice all around. And those pans of ice is where you go do your hunting. The walrus haul out in 2s and 3s on those pans of ice. And so they slowly, motor up or paddle up in their skin boat. And that's where they dispatch, the walrus. But so that scenario has changed. That phenomenon isn't there. So it's much harder to get to where the walrus are. And then the safety problem is that Now that there isn't that sea ice all around, that whenever there is a storm in May or June or whenever they're out hunting, now it's open fetch, and the Bering Sea is, pretty shallow, so it doesn't take a lot of wind or a long period of time before the waves get really big without having that sea ice. So people on St. Lawrence Island have been losing their lives, to this exact phenomena. And so we go from, these boats in the previous image, 50, 60 foot, very seaworthy. I've never heard anyone else say this, but this is my interpretation, is I see Diometers as the Polynesians of the Arctic in terms of their ability as, incredible mariners. But they've traded in this very seaworthy craft that they can repair on the go. They know the insides and outs. The young boys start learning the ins and outs of them at about the age of 8 and become very skilled. And now they've traded them in for these, arguably pretty junky little aluminum skiffs that are so much less safe. And then the conditions themselves are much less safe. So this has been a big change. So this is the frame of the last umiak or skin boat that the tribe had used. And it's, like I say, it's been since 2015 since they've had enough access to walrus to be able to put a skin on it. And, who knows if that will occur again. The Geo of Hope is kind of the theme here, so I don't want to be a downer. And there is this conversation, around, how adaptable is Diomede in the face of climate change, and there are reasons to be hopeful. These are two, pictures of the place back to back, winter and summer. And in the last presentation I gave about Diomede, I talked about how permafrost melt has also been really affecting the community in a variety of ways. But one of them is just the erosion. And you can see in this picture, it's very steep. And, that permafrost used to keep everything kind of very well locked up behind them, above them. But now, there's a lot of worry of erosion and other concerns related to the permafrost thawing. But this presentation, what I decided to do is switch and talk about another component that I wasn't able to fit into the current draft of the film, but I think is really important, and that is the food web that is the Bering Strait. This is a food web. I guess we call it a poster or a mural that my significant other made with the children of Diomede. And what it was representing here is the sun is there in the middle, and then all of the variety of creatures that Diomeders know and depend on and have relationships with, that kind of all originate out from the sun. The point that I want to try to get across in the film, and I feel like is a bridge to an outside of Alaskan audience, is that a lot of people, if they don't know much about Alaska, they might know about our king crab because of that TV show. And they might know about our king crab because maybe they've had it, at a restaurant. There are these, enormous, beautiful crab. And that fishery is just a little bit to the south of Diomede. And that fishery has collapsed recently. It's entirely closed. And there have been, a variety of, reasons given, but, climate is part of the driver. But what makes that abundance? What makes these, just enormous crab? What makes, the Bristol Bay region where, the largest sockeye salmon run in the world, currently, the biggest run that still is in existence. What provides that abundance? What provides the abundance of marine resource wealth that creates these massive walrus and the huge numbers, and what drives migrations of whales to come from as far south as Mexico to come up and feed in these rich waters? It all, it starts ultimately with the sun, but it really also starts with the sea ice. On the bottom of the sea ice, algae forms, and that algae rains down onto the seafloor, and that's what really provides the base of the material food web. that is this rich abundance that, we know. And, that's a point that I really am trying to, get across. I think a lot of times people can, dismiss, oh, it's a small tribe of 80 or 90 people that are being affected. But, when we start to think holistically, that we're tugging on these massive levers in the world and disrupting entire ecosystems, it starts to become more personal and, and more relatable to all of us, that this is an issue that is affecting Diomede very acutely right this minute, but it's coming for every single person alive on this planet if we don't really get serious about, tackling this issue. So I don't want to leave off on the heavy, climate change is going to kill us all story. So I want to leave, with talking about some of the, the things that give me a sense of hope for the place. And that is that these wisdom keepers are still alive, and they're a part of an unbroken, chain of knowledge, oral history that, goes back, longer than the pyramids of Giza, before Mesopotamia. These people have been here practicing these, learning the ecology of the region, learning the lessons and paying it forward to the next generation. And people like this man here, Suluk, is one of these people that takes great pride in knowing his traditional practices, but then really takes a lot of pride in, in teaching it to the next generation. And so what he's doing here in this picture is putting a new net on his bird harvesting net. So in the summer in Diomede, millions of seabirds nest in the rocks. And so two of their, annual subsistence resources are the eggs that come, from, the birds nesting in the rocks. And then they use long-handled nets like this, and they sit in these blinds, and they wait until the birds flock up and fly overhead, and then they swoop the net up into the air and catch the birds out of the air. And and they're thinking about winter, right? They're thinking not just like a meal, they're thinking about putting food away for the coming year. And so I haven't seen this technique that they call, but the term they use is called halala. And what it is when the whole village works together on these bird harvesting subsistence practices. And so what they'll do is the men will go into these blinds with their nets, and the kids will go up above, and they bring like Folgers coffee cans or pots and pans. And when one of the elders gives the symbol, the kids start banging the pots and pans, and they make a bunch of ruckus, and then all the birds flock up. And then, the people with the nets, then are catching, bunches and bunches of, birds simultaneously. And this is in one of these blinds. And this is a practice that I was aware of, ever since I was a kid. And there's some really neat historic footage of it that I'd seen and was always really, fascinated by. And it was on my birthday 2 years ago that I got to go out and, spend from about 8 p.m. to 3 a.m. out with harvesting, which was just a real treat to kind of, hear stories from him, but then to actually see the techniques in practice. And there's just no way to capture the abundance of the seabirds. Crested auklets are, kind of make up the, that's the most populous bird, but there are murres and other species of auklets that are there as well. And, Diomeders know every bird and have, they have, a greater understanding than any of the hardcore ornithologists that I know. And, living here in Homer, this is a very science-oriented community and lots of, bird fanatics here. But listening to Diomeders talk, that it's a different kind of conversation, but it's with a real deep respect and reverence and understanding of the peculiarities of each species, which is just fantastic. There's some more of those. The Tyox is the word that they use for them. And another interesting thing, so this island is only 3 miles long by 2 miles wide, and it's about 1,300 feet high at the highest point. And, I always think, my instinct is that, if I were to live in some place that cloistered, that I would eventually feel, claustrophobic and, feel the need to get out. But the times that I've spent there and, spend out, on the land with people, every single time, and, and maybe it's a little bit of, the putting on a show for my sake, but I don't think that's the case. I just get the sense that they're always still enthralled and learning about this, what is, what appears to be, from an outside perspective, a kind of a small place. But every single area has a name and it has a story, and and somebody's always filling in some little piece of that story as we're out on these walks. And so this is a kind of a famous, landmark there that everyone calls the Shoe. But the island is filled with these little secret, hidey spots. And, part of my feelings about, ecological issues and ecology is that, we need to learn how to live in our place better. Globalization and industrialization has, kind of been the driving force that is leading to these, massive ecological changes all over the world. And, we hear the terms global north, global south, that it's the first world that is, producing all the emissions, and the third world that is, not, is receiving the negative externalities of those emissions. But, this is, supposedly this is the first world, but they're very much, in the other sense, they're a part of that, the global south, and that they're not the people causing the problem. In fact, I see these people as providing a solution for, how we back ourselves out of this problem of learning how to live in harmony with the place where we live, and not demanding so much of the world for our fulfillment and gratification. Because these people, for me, feel very fulfilled and gratified. And so much so, as I'm kind of nearing the end of my conversation here, like the idea of moving, which I'll get to in a minute. But, part of another thing that, is really phenomenal about this community is their community health and wellness. I've heard, like I've spent a lot of time, I grew up in in a rural community, and I've spent a lot of time in other rural villages. And oftentimes, drugs and alcohol can really be devastating, in these places. And, sometimes it takes years, if ever, before people get back on the road of, community health and wellness and recovery. And Diomeders have all told me that there was a period of time where that really was what was happening. And they really looked inward and doubled down on their traditional practices. And so regularly, they all will meet together for big feasts. They meet regularly for the traditional, they call it Eskimo dancing, but it's their traditional, native music that they perform. And they perform it for the entire community. Everybody turns out to the gymnasium to, be a part of these, performances that everybody takes, pretty seriously. And one of the younger men, this man in the plaid in the middle, he's one of the proteges of Diomede music. Most of the songs are ancient songs, and they'll tell you the story before they start a song, whose great-great-grandfather wrote it and what it means, and, how, it used to be shared with the Russians, or it used to be shared with Kosovo, or somebody modified it from mainland or whatever. Each of them have a story. But there haven't been a lot of composers in modern times. But this man, Justin, here in the middle, he's really taken it upon himself to write new compositions. And it's something that really fills this community with a lot of pride to know that they're propelling their, cultural art form forward into the future. And, again, talking about this, this sharing and continuation of, these, cultural practices, you see it in the youth so strong. There's concurrently, again, there's this other thing that's happening, is that as it's becoming more challenging to practice traditional subsistence, the community's also been bombarded with technology. And so some of the kids, are really distracted by that. But there are some that are really not, and they're looking for, guidance from these elders. And so Jojo here is one of my favorite people on the island. He makes it a practice, when he goes out hunting, never to just think about, himself. He's trying to get enough tyuks to feed his entire family of two sisters, mother, and adopted kind of like a stepmother, the people that he lives with. And he's always thinking about being able to provide enough for them. And it brings, you can tell for him, it fills him with a sense of gratitude. And for them, it just makes them their absolute darling. So the kind of the last point that I wanted to get to is thinking about how, when I've explained Diomede and some of the problems that they're confronting to other friends here in Alaska, one of the things that I've heard people, say just kind of offhandedly is, why don't they just move? It just sounds, kind of untenable. And so in the 1990s, before things started becoming, as hard as they are now, they actually voted on this issue, and they were pretty unanimous in their decision to stay. That sense of connection to place is very strong in them, and that was the decision that they made then. And I'm pretty sure that it is on people's minds now as things get more intense. But so as I mentioned, I've been to the island twice, once in the winter and then once in the summer. And then, spent 21 days stranded in Nome trying to get out there in the winter months. The second time I made it out, I actually hitched a ride with some of the construction workers who were working on the island on their boat. And we also were joined by 3 kids that had been visiting relatives in Nome. And, the oldest, I think, is maybe 12. And so, when we leave mainland Seward Peninsula, Alaska, and then it's a 25-mile crossing, open water crossing to get to Diomede. And it, like I say, it was a summer month, it was July, and the wind was blowing towards us as we approached the island. And about 2 miles away, all 3 of these kids light up. They stand up, and what they can smell is the guano, the smell of the birds that are nesting on the island. I'd only been in Nome for a couple of weeks, but they all just let out this sigh of like, Diomede, home. And in that moment, like, that's when it became incredibly clear to me that this kind of Western, maybe, like settler colonial mentality of like, well, if, something's not working out where you are, just pick up and go somewhere else where it's better. That's a new concept for, a lot of people in the world. When you consider that they've been living there for thousands of years, and that all of your cosmology and your understanding of the world is all based on that place. So this notion of that they should just move because it's becoming, more difficult, it isn't something that I think is going to go down very easy. And I'm really hopeful that there will be strategies that these people will be able to employ, that they're not so dependent on the supply chain as they are now, and find new strategies to be able to maintain some of that subsistence flexibility that they had, pre-2013, let's say. And so that's a little bit of my hope. But as a documentarian, it's not my job to project. I'm here to tell their story. But those are some of the musings I have, in thinking about this complicated film. And so, speaking of the film, there, I'm trying to get back out there this spring, but this entire April, it's been nothing but blizzards out there. There's been very few helicopter flights. So conceivably, I'll be going again in either May or June at the latest. And then my hope is to have this film finalized and done by springtime, or I should say winter time next year, 2025. And so the last thing I'm going to do is play a like a 3-minute trailer from the current version that I have. And then if anybody has questions, I'm happy to take them. Like that,
Right here in Little Diomede, we're at the border of international date line we shared with Russia. Little Diomede is about 3 miles around, a little over 1,300 feet high, sedimentary granite rock. That's what it is made of. It is dwelt by natives who lived and dwelt here for 10,000 years. And the reason they picked this place is it's resourceful. We have birds, abundance of it. There's about 30 to 40 species of birds. And we have the mammals that do pass through here, which is the whale. The whales consist of the gray, the bowhead, the minke, the humpback, the orcas, the porpoise. Our sustenance mainly is the walrus, which we get. So those are what migrate seasonally. In the past 10 years now, we've seen changes and affected our way of life, climatic way.
Climate change. You know, Diomede, I've noticed it maybe a good 10 years back. Noticed the warming, you know, the change in the plant, the ice condition, how the pressure ice forms here. It's been a big notice for Diomede. I think with our location we're at, it makes us more understanding that it's gonna change more. It changes how we hunt, how we gather, how we survive Diomede.
Okay, I'm going to take the screen share off and then, yeah, again, I guess you can open it up for questions if anybody has any.
There are questions. I am gonna some really great questions. You touched a little bit on the social media, like that there is some amount of connectivity. But there were two questions related to this. one of them was, if someone's trapped on the ice and separated from mainland, what can people do to get help?
Well, yeah, in modern times, that's, that's part of like, the life saving. So there's a famous plane crash that happened with a, bunch of Diometers on board, and the plane, crashed on sea ice that was, dislodged and drifting, but it was, recent enough in time that, the technology to be able to communicate that. And then the Coast Guard was able to, rescue them. But there are many stories, from, 30s, 40s, 50s that people still remember of, one in particular that was striking was a couple of, or three men got dislodged and drifted around the inside of, between Big Diomede and the mainland of, Siberia side, and then drifted all the way back around to the north side of the Seward Peninsula. And two of them ended up, succumbing to hypothermia, and the other one had, had to have his feet amputated because of frostbite. So, that is something that, has changed. That technology has allowed people to communicate, when something
Interesting. Okay.
like that has happened. Yeah.
So it sounds as though there is some also social media access, which is another question people had. There is like some internet or something like this.
Yeah, and that's really, kind of stepped up in just the last few years with, like Starlink. Like the Starlink is what's being adopted in a lot of rural Alaskan, villages, and giving people kind of like reliable internet access, whereas before it was spotty internet access through a cellular provider, and it was mostly at the school. And so people would hover around, the school to get the hotspot, or whatever, to get the Wi-Fi. Yeah.
Another question related to kind of connectivity, but of a different sort, is someone asked, how do people get vegetables and fruit? Do you depend on Nome for supplies? Do they gather native vegetation? Seaweed was one of the questions. We saw a little snippet in the trailer of someone gathering something, but yeah, could you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, I mean, it's actually the most abundant vegetable village I've ever been to, of wild vegetative material. And there's a little bit of seaweed harvesting, but there are three main greens that grow on the island, and one in particular that as far as we can tell, it only grows on the Diomedes and maybe a little bit, on the Russian side. And it is this singular, distinct plant that is so delicious, and they really value it and really, like harvest it in abundance. Traditionally, what they would do is store it in seal oil to have it, last through the year. But now they freeze it, and it goes in basically every stew and every soup, and it is just so flavorful. It's kind of like a cross between like a parsley but this like there's a brighter, sweeter taste to it. But then there are these little wild potatoes that they harvest there, and a bunch of different berries. So that's the wild harvesting. And then otherwise there, there are some rural Alaskan stores that will have fresh fruit, quote unquote, but it's all brown and, horrible looking. And so fresh fruits and vegetables is just a non-thing in rural Alaska. So, you get vegetable or frozen or canned, if you want vegetables, those are your options as far as store-bought goes. Someone
Asked what the population is.
It always fluctuates. So, it's had, as, recent as the 80s, it was in the like 200s, but right now it's around 90.
Oh, wow. Okay.
Yep. But it comes and goes. It's not, it's not this linear thing. People will leave for a while to go, pursue a job or whatever, but people are drawn back. So sometimes, in a matter of a few years, it can increase by 40, 50 people, like pretty fast.
Okay. And then another question that people were curious about was, if other walrus dependent villages are experiencing these same downturns in walrus harvesting.
Well, yes, but differently. This is where it's being felt most acute. There's a whole other story, with what's changing with the walrus that I didn't go into. So Diomede is actually the place where in the spring, when breakup happens, when the sea ice breaks up, historically, the females with the pups would drift with the sea ice towards the pole for the summer and forage off of this shelf, this moving platform. And the males all head south into Bristol Bay. These are the Alaskan side. The similar things going on the Russian side, but on the Alaskan side, the males all go south and they go to these haul outs in Bristol Bay. But now that that shelf for the females with the young ones to go on isn't reliable, so now they're hauling out on land in large numbers on land and foraging from the same zone. So Point Lay is another native village where it's a new thing. They're hauling out right near that village. And so the future seems pretty grim because, before the walrus were foraging in new areas as they were drifting on the sea ice, but now they're only able to forage as far as they can swim. And so it seems kind of unlikely it seems likely that they're going to deplete those resources, at a certain point because they're only, foraging for the clams and other, mollusks and such in a much more constrained area. But yeah, I mean, yeah, everything's changed with how people hunt walrus, but nowhere is experiencing it as acutely as Diomede, just because they depended on them so heavily, and because how they now are migrating and working has changed so much, and they don't have the ability to travel as far to go get them to where they are now. Yeah.
Sorry, I was on mute.
No.
Are there any new resources coming into the region because of climate change as they lose this one?
Oh, well, you mean like natural resources?
Yeah.
Absolutely. Yeah. I mean, this is the big thing that's happening is there's this huge regime change going on in the Bering and the Chukchi seas. So, the cold water tolerant species are moving north, fish, in particular, and these warmer water adapted ones are moving in. So a lot of cod species are coming in, and this again is some of the ecologists that are monitoring this issue and following it. Part of their hopeful thing is that there can be new subsistence strategies employed by Diomeders and other people in coastal Alaska, is that there is this new abundance, of different things that have never been seen there before. And so that, that does kind of provide somewhat of an opportunity,
Yeah. Okay. That is a little hopeful then.
Mm-hmm.
Let's see. This is a completely different kind of chain of thought, but one question, and I feel like this might be a little bit of this is not really what you're speaking to in this film, because it sounds as though this community is quite kind of not really entrenched with the fossil fuel industry in the same way, but in our work we definitely see the intimate relationship between fossil fuel and many Alaskan communities, and we're kind of watching all of this play out with Alaskans recognizing the impact of climate change because they're seeing it so firsthand, but then also still being very much tied to the fossil fuel industry. And so I wonder if this conversation happens in this community, or what that looks like here in Alaska.
Yeah, I mean, yes, I mean, it has come up candidly on its own. You know, people make fun of, you know, the North Slope communities, you know, that they're very wealthy and they're profiting off of, you know, the destruction of the planet, and kind of, you know, have a, you know, a bit of a sour attitude about that. You know, there's nothing, I don't have anything on record, and I, you know, I don't think that would be my job in this film to try to, you know, create those kind of derisive and divisive sort of statements. But that's certainly a comment that I've heard in Diomede and in other, you know, coastal Alaska communities. You know, we have the Alaska Federation of Natives, and a few years ago, the Gwich'in people proposed you know, declaring a climate emergency, and those, you know, North Slope tribes pulled out of the, you know, the Federation of Natives because of that. You know, that they're kind of unwilling to you know, to accept this, you know, stark reality that fossil fuel production is leading to the direct, you know, loss of traditional subsistence lifeways, and, you know, permafrost is melting and the sea ice is disappearing and all these things. You know, it's a very clear story, but some people are very much profiting off of it.
Another question is if the inhabitants record their family history in a way that genealogists can understand their heritage.
I never heard that. I mean, they know their own genealogy pretty well, you know, going back at least 3-4 generations. But and there may have been some, you know, other project with like their, you know, the regional Native Corp, you know, may have done something like, but I've not heard of anything specific. But, you know, like I say, you know, before Soviet era, one of the interesting stories that, you know, was told to me is that they you know, they've all of these remote communities have a deep understanding of how important it is to, you know, to keep the blood fresh, or they'll use you know, terms like that. Not allowing in you know, intermarrying, you know, too close to your kin. And so there was a kind of a solemn responsibility, a matriarchal responsibility in the community to match make. And so King Island, you know, village on Big Diomede, mainland Alaska, you know, the Seward Peninsula communities, that, you know, they were always really good about, you know, keeping the blood, you know, fresh. And so they go, you know, they can go back really well and tell you stories. You know, they look through a lot of times, you know, working with them in on this project, looking at historic photos, and everybody can tell, you know, people can tell me, you know, who everyone is and whose, you know, relative they are and how they're related to that person and that person. And so that, you know, at least 3, 4, 5 generations worth of genealogy is really well understood.
Wow. Okay. We are definitely running over time a little bit, but we have a last question that I think is an easy one to answer, which is, well, actually two. I think they're easier. Was this island like used strategically at all during World War II?
No, it wasn't. You know, on mainland, right, you know, right across from there is the native village of Wales on the Alaska side, and there's an old little mining town called Tin City, and that had radar domes, and you know, was like a base, you know, during World War II, and is still an active kind of like, you know, early detection, early warning. But Diomede itself, there are several men that are on the island who are with the National Guard, and they do this kind of like unofficial, you know, reporting, but there's no military, you know, establishment or base, or, you know, and there never was, you know, on Diomede, which is kind of interesting, you know, that didn't happen, you know.
Yeah. Okay. And then the last question is, what language do they speak?
So they're a part of the Inupiat language group, which is interesting because St. Lawrence Island, which is just a little south, is actually Siberian Yupik language group. But yeah, they're Inupiat, and their specific dialect is Inyalik. And that's like the name of their, their people too, specifically is Inyalik. But yeah, it's Inupiat, which is, Inuit, generally speaking, but in Alaska, it's called Inupiat.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much. And I just really loved hearing all of these interesting things about the community and how everything is unfolding there. We are totally over time. So everyone, thank you so much for joining us. It was so wonderful to hear this, and great to have all of you join us. Happy Passover to those of you celebrating. And I hope that you will join us next month. On May 20th, we're going to have another Geo of Hope, and we'll be sending out an email of it relatively shortly. So thanks again, Bjorn. Thanks everyone for coming, and have a wonderful rest of your evening.
Thank you, everyone.
Bye.